Welcome to the Peace Country Historical Society podcast, where we blend community voices with historical expertise and talk about history in the Peace Country. From early settlers to modern trailblazers, we explore how history shapes our lives today. Subscribe to the Peace Country Historical Society podcast, where the past speaks and we listen.
Welcome again to our third podcast. This one is focused on museums and the skill of museology as it relates to the Peace Country, especially the Museum of Grande Prairie. And our guest today is Charles Taws, who is our curator, manager. He is the man who knows the collection and cares for the collection and has offered to come and share some of the things that are part of his life and were once part of our life, the material culture of the Peace Country. So the other thing about museums is we have this image. I suppose if everyone could kind of think about the first time they actually went to a museum, and I asked them, what is your memory of it? As a school child, we were trucked off every June when the teachers had enough of us. We got a tour of a museum somewhere. And because Ottawa was the capital and we only lived about 20 miles south of it, I got to see the national museums of all different things, War Museum, aviation, what was called the National Museum on Victoria Street, which later was torn down and replaced, well, not torn down, but superseded by the Museum of Civilization, Museum of Man on the other side of the Ottawa River. But it meant that museums for us were these awestruck, giant hallways. But it was stuff that we kind of looked at, but a lot of it we didn't even understand until we were into grade 7 and 8. And so for us, museums had this image of being piles of old stuff, kind of bric-a-brac, and maybe something our grandmother had one of, but no sense of what it meant to have a national museum or a private museum or a provincial or a county or a city museum. They were for us a place that we visited, got a day off school, got to see some. As I got older, especially the museum that was in the Victoria, because it had all the taxidermy and, of course, totem poles, and it was dedicated more to the domestic Canada. But Pioneer Museum, inconceivable to us in the 60s, And now we have, of course, regional, municipal, and a professional team of people like yourself. Can you remember the first museum you went to?
Well, when you said that, I had to think, and yes, I can. I'm not sure how old I was, maybe 4 or 5, but it would be the Chateau de Ramsey in Montreal.
Oh, yes.
Of course, goes back to the 1600s.
Yes.
My mom worked there as a secretary in the 40s, but I don't think that's why we were visiting. I think we just happened to be in downtown Montreal. But the big takeaway from that is I remember a penny farthing bicycle in one of the, it had the basement was sold, there were arches, and one of the arches was one of these penny farthing bicycles.
Oh, my.
So I remember seeing that, but that's pretty well my only memory. But I've been back there as an adult. Of course, it's all changed now.
Well, that's the thing. When I think of them now, a lot of them have elaborate displays, but a lot of them have less stuff.
Yes, it seems to be a new wave in museums. A lot of them are made to accommodate school groups. They need larger space.
Okay.
And there's more on the hands-on activity than the actual artifacts. So, but kind of hope for a happy medium there. I see the need for both. And I remember the old style. I think the museum you're referring to in Ottawa is now the Museum of Natural History.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And was the Parliament buildings for a short time when they burnt down in 1960.
That's right.
Yeah, so those ones, of course, I remember the Royal Ontario Museum.
Yes.
Which was case upon case, beautiful old wooden cases filled with, one hallway would be all this African stuff, another one would be taxidermy animals, another one all this Egyptian stuff. And of course, they're well known for all their ancient world artifacts that they have. And there is a place for that too. Even as a kid, there's not a lot of hands-on, but you can use your imagination. And of course, it gives you some visual stimulus to the stuff you're reading in your history books in school.
Absolutely. My Latin book in grade 10 was full of photographs from the Royal Ontario Museum. So imagine when I finally got to do my MA across the road in the archives, I'd walk into the ROM and see them, the real thing, you know. And it is so different to see the real thing in color, and you get a sense of the age. But you're right, without a very good labeling system or without a display, they still lack context or meaning, you know. So you like our blend of a lot of things, but also accessible to the public.
I do, and I do agree with your comment there about the label. Label is so important. Writing an exhibit label can be an art unto itself. It's, you know, to get that bit of information you want to get out in as short a time or short a space as possible, because long labels nobody's going to read.
True.
And they've done studies about this. There's actually an ailment out there known as museum fatigue, and the average museum's visitor attention span, although they're on your site for 2 hours, their attention span might be 20 minutes where they're actually going to read before they just start walking around. So you have to grab them at that time. And, you know, there's this whole science in the larger museums anyway about where to place the benches, where someone's going to need to sit down, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
Smaller museums like mine, we do have benches and things, although we haven't scientifically placed them like some of the larger ones have.
Yeah, what a great, I never thought of that. But when you think about the museums I visited, you can see how setting them up to maximize attention, but also not immerse you in too much technical detail. You know, my problem is I wander into a museum and I'm gone for the rest of the day. The family has left hours before and they're off to get an ice cream cone, and I'm still wandering through the first exhibit. What about guiding in a museum like ours? Is that a special task, or?
It is, and we do guiding on request. I wish we could offer it for every visitor, but it's just not feasible. But we do have guided tours. People appreciate guided tours. Often they say, you know, we've been here many times, but the best visit we had was when we had the guided tour, because it made things come alive, because you could tell the stories behind the things. And it's all very good to know that this item was made at this date, but you're not going to remember that. But if you're going to hear a story about, you know, this lady named Aunt Sally who used it in an irregular way, you're going to laugh about it and remember that.
Right.
And it's going to be a lot of fun, you know.
It's funny you should mention Aunt Sally, because when I look at our museum, I'm looking at really a slice mostly of the last 150 years, really, or less, because the artifacts come often from the time when settlement began here. People brought something up. You've got a wonderful exhibit of what a sled looked like coming up the Edson Trail.
Yes.
Heavily overloaded with everything but the kitchen sink, because people are bringing everything they think they need. But you also have another display of an earlier time when, of course, Indigenous people were living with technology made often of stone or bone. But in both cases, it's a real snapshot of family life as well as ancient or modern history. It's so funny because for me, as a historian, I would take my classes from the college down and I'd say, we're going into this exhibit, you're going to try to imagine life with a stone or lithic technology, and now I'm going to take you 100 years ahead to here's the railway, now look at the difference, you know. Why can't they coexist with those sorts of things? Because your stuff is your life. It tells a lot about you, right?
Well, a lot of the stone stuff was superseded by the mass-produced stuff. It was easier to get, cheaper to get, and that's, of course, part of the fur trade, which led to the settlement of this area, and it changes in the Indigenous population in this area as well.
Yes, yes. People often ask me about, you know, why weren't they constantly seeking more guns to hunt with? And, you know, the answer is if you haven't lived on the land, one is enough. Carrying 4 or 5, why? They're hard to portage, they're heavy, and hard to fix.
Right.
So just give me one good one, thank you. That's all I need. Yeah.
They were expensive too.
So, yes, exactly. Now, what would you say are the philosophical or theoretical things you have to work with, you know?
Well, there's a couple of aspects there. I'll just talk a bit about the Grande Prairie Museum. So you mentioned about the Edson Trail. So our museum actually started in 1962.
Right.
And in that regard, we're actually way ahead of the rest of the country because most of the community museums, the pioneer villages, they didn't start till 1967, was the centennial year. So in 1962, the Museum Society was formed, and it was formed to preserve the pioneer history. And in fact, the name used to be the Pioneer Museum. And that makes us the same as most other communities. That was sort of the focus back then. But the museum started, so the society started 62. The building was built in 68, but it didn't open until 70, so it took them some time.
Right.
And the original building is still within the structure. It's basically the display gallery. The other parts have been added on over the years. And then, of course, the Pioneer Village started in 74. Not exactly sure what led to the impetus of that starting. Perhaps a building had become available. The Tempest House from Cluskin Hill was the first, and then the McQueen Church, which is a very important building to the history of Grande Prairie, followed by the Hermit Lake School, and then the host of others followed. Finally with the Pavera Caboose, I guess, is the last feature, but the last building would be the Hudson's Bay Post from La Glace, which is a very important building in Alberta provincial history because it's the only purpose-built Hudson's Bay Post still existing in the province of Alberta.
Is that right?
Yeah, and that's from David Leonard. So,
So
there are lots of other Hudson Bay Posts, but they weren't built as Hudson Bay Posts.
So you're not just telling, you want people to know not just what this thing is, but what it means.
Well, and how important it is to the history. And everyone who takes even general Canadian history knows about the importance of the Hudson's Bay Company to Canadian history. And it's nice that we have that little piece of it here. And we do have, a flag pole with the Hudson's Bay flag flying. We also have a flagpole in front of the Hermit Lake School with the Union Jack flying, which is the flags that they would have flown. And of course, we do that for historical accuracy. But we had a very angry gentleman show up one day with 2 modern Canadian flags telling us to get it right. But he didn't seem to understand that it was historical accuracy we're after in the village.
That's funny. So, he needs to go back east and see all the old fur trade forts and War of 1812 posts and everything else then that have the Union Jack too. It's funny, we're going to reach a period, I think, where the Union Jack is unknown. God Save the King or God Save the Queen is almost unknown now. And the way things are going, more and more people will have to be taught what those things were, which you and I remember from opening exercises in our schools.
Yes.
All of our growth years were spent with both that and something called the Lord's Prayer.
Yes, well, I remember that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
it's funny to see in our lifetime that change.
Yes,
because our parents didn't see that much change, I don't think.
No, indeed.
And now we've seen a lot of change, and I've brought some items here that might help illustrate.
Well, exactly. Change. That's a great segue, Charles. Tell us what we have here.
Well, let's start with the most. I thought maybe I'd get some chuckles by bringing the phone in because a telephone to certain people, they're going, that's nothing special. We had lots of those phones, and everybody knows what it is. And of course, today they're wrong. Not everyone knows what it is. A telephone is now outside of the memory of a certain demographic. Children, I'm going to guess about 15 years and younger, do not know what a telephone is. They've never seen one. They've grown up with cell phones. They don't even know how to hold the receiver properly.
Right.
They hold it like a cell phone because they've never seen anyone use it.
Now, tell us why we're wearing gloves.
Okay, so we put on gloves because things that are donated to the museum, when we accession into our collection, that's like the formal transfer of ownership of the item to the museum. So in theory, it's going to be in the museum forever.
Great.
So we try to keep everything in climate control conditions, as safe as possible. And we wear the gloves because there's acid in our hands. Right. And we can touch these items and you're not going to see any difference. But 100 years down the road, it could develop into a mark or leave a scratch or something. Right. So we wear the gloves just to help preserve it.
So which end do you hold?
So, of course, we all know we know we're of a certain age.
The cord has to be at the bottom.
Right, and you talk into it this way, not this way as you would a cell phone.
Exactly,
right?
yes.
And, of course, but it makes sense. That's what they would think. So here we are within the last 15 years, I'd say, this has become ancient history.
No kidding.
And when you show this to kids, and I purposely brought the rotary dial, not the push-button version, because when you show the kids that they have to manually do this and the time it takes for that dial to go back, they don't believe you that anyone would put up with that inconvenience.
Yes, that's
and I have
true.
to admit, I never thought about the time it takes the dial to go back. But if you have a lot of zeros in your number, it's going to take you quite a while to dial that number.
That's right.
And of course, time is important. So,
yes, it seems to take forever, doesn't it? Yes.
So I just thought that's a really good item to highlight some of the changes that are happening more quickly now, I'd say, than in the past. And so people come to the museum either for nostalgia. School kids might come to learn about this ancient technology for a project, but the older folks will come and go, I remember I had one of those.
Exactly. Yes. The thing that I always forget until I look at them is they had the alphabet embedded in them as well.
That's right.
So that you could dial letters and names. In some of the old phone numbers, you would have to call the operator and say Regent 65 or something like that.
Or in Bowmanville, if you were downtown, it would be MA 2734. There were 4 digits, and MA actually stood for market because that's where the farmers market was.
Right.
So you started with the letters, and then it could be a 3, and then it was 4 number, and then I think we went to the current system with the 3 and then the 4
The secret code. Well, it's like area codes now are constantly being added on to as the demand increases. I mean, Carol and I coming here in 1990, remember that nobody had to dial 780 to go anywhere, and now we've got, 3 or 4 area codes for Alberta.
Dial the area code.
Yeah. Some of area codes we avoid because we know they're coming from scammers, but we didn't have much phone fraud in the days of dial phones.
Well, not as much, no. Yeah, things were a little different. There were still fraudsters around. They just did it differently.
Yes, begging phone calls and things like that. Yeah. What else have we got here?
Oh, I brought this other item here. It's a tin box. It says Players on it. It's actually a cigarette tin. But the interesting thing, I mean, we still see cigarettes today. There are still some smokers, but of course, I grew up in a general store, and our cigarettes were all displayed right behind us. And we were kids, and we were dispensing cigarettes to customers, cigars, chewing tobacco, all that stuff. And now, of course, you have to be a certain age, and it has to be hidden. But prior to my era, I think yours as well, the cigarettes came in these metal boxes, which, we had cardboard ones, but they're called flat 50s. There would have been 50 cigarettes in here. Right. And, when you talk about with the kids about how their grandparents smoked, and they will say, well, were our grandparents stupid? And you go, well, no, they're not stupid. Well, they won't use the word stupid, but they just didn't know. And of course, we had the media at the time was promoting cigarettes.
Doctors recommending them. And
that's right.
Yes,
Lucky Strikes, 9 out of 10 doctors, Lucky Strike cigarettes. Yes. And then, of course, when they started getting an idea that the cigarettes were unhealthy for you, we have mentholated. Yes. Like it was better, right?
Right, yes, so that's right.
It was part of embedded in the culture. So you get not only the cigarettes, but the ashtrays, which used to be ubiquitous. But you can look around this room here, there isn't one.
No ashtray,
30 years ago, there would have been, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And they're now part of history. And they're often, to antique collectors, they've been, it's a new category called sinware.
Oh.
So because it's a sin, right? So smoking, drinking, paraphernalia all falls under
sinware. I love it.
Yeah, so that's an old style cigarette tin, flat 50. Very useful for storing nails and screws, and that's how most of them got saved. But to find them in relatively, in good condition can be quite scarce. So.
That's fantastic. Players, I remember that because they had the sailor on it, right?
That's right.
There was one used in World War I. The chaplains actually used to hand out cigarettes, and to the wounded even, here, have a cigarette while you're recovering from your wounds, right? They were called Woodbines or Gold Flakes. And I still meet the odd veteran talking about Gold Flakes because that's what he had to smoke when he was overseas.
Okay.
The brand names there was a code. Some were better than others. Like, don't take a Woodbine because it tastes like burned grass. But get a Gold Flake if you want a real smoke,
Well, in World War I, all the soldiers got those beautiful brass boxes from Princess Mary filled with monogrammed cigarettes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
no, it's amazing. A sidelight, cigarettes actually, when they were introduced, cut down on chewing tobacco and cigars.
Right.
In World War I, the demand for chewing tobacco dropped when cigarettes were introduced at the front. And which makes me really wonder, in such an unsanitary environment, who cared if you were chewing tobacco? But
I guess.
Yeah,
I think
no kidding.
chewing tobacco is disgusting. But we had customers, Old Chum and Redman were the top brands.
Exactly.
This was in the 1980s.
Yeah, and I was working in a senior citizens home filled with veterans for my summer job, and chewing tobacco was everywhere, including the floor. Speaking as a janitor.
Spittoons,
Well,
yeah.
exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
What's that? Well, it's a planter. No, it's not.
Spittoon, and we have several at the museum because spittoons would have been a common item at the beginning of Grande Prairie history.
In every
pioneer
bar.
history.
Yeah. I wonder if they had them in the church. You wonder, eh?
Probably not, but
Probably
they're
not.
definitely the barber shops.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, indeed.
restaurants,
Post
and
office. Yeah, right. And then this glassware is interesting.
Oh, okay. I brought this because, well, one, it's quite plain, but it's for those of us that are a certain age, we automatically know it's a milk bottle, but a child's not going to know that. Now, if they look at the lid here, it's got pure fresh milk on it, so that would give them a clue. The cardboard tabs.
Yes.
Now, so this is quite unremarkable, but it's still an artifact. Collectors like the ones that have the dairy name on them. Northern Alberta Dairy Pool would be the one up here. They also like the caps with the name on them as well. And some of them are quite rare and worth a lot of money. But a lot of dairies would just use these plain bottles, often interspersed with the bottles with their names because they were cheaper replacements.
Right.
But still, this can tell us a little bit about the idea of the milk coming in glass bottles. This happens to be a Canadian bottle. Do you know how I know?
No.
You don't know?
No.
Oh. So if you look on the bottom,
Yeah.
there's a D inside a diamond.
Oh.
So that means it's the Dominion
Dominion of Canada, yeah.
So that's a Canadian bottle. And, when you start talking about milk coming in bottles, you could buy it at a store, but most people had it delivered to the house.
Yes.
So the milk could come every day, could come every other day. And when Grande Prairie, the pioneers first came, the milk would be delivered by horse and wagon.
Yep.
And, you hear all sorts of stories that there's a whole part of the culture. The milkman would come. He would, if the milkman was sick and he had a substitute, it didn't matter if he knew who the customers were or not because the horse did.
Yes.
The horse would stop at the houses of the customers. And we still had milkman and actually the bakery stuff delivered to the house right up until the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
So people, customer service is a big topic right now. Value for money is a big topic right now. Well, we had it back then too, but in a different form.
No kidding.
And, in my case, like our milkman saw us all grow up. I had an older brother who passed away quite young, and the milkman came to the funeral. So almost like a member of the family.
Yeah. Wow.
So and these would come, they'd be stored in crates and then drop by your doorstep. Some houses had special boxes in the wall for the milk.
That's right.
And you could just
there was
open
an
it up
inside
from the
door
inside.
and an outside door.
Yeah,
Yes.
so-
We broke into my grandmother's house on a regular basis that way because we would often forget to bring the key.
Oh, right.
So
yeah.
we'd find the youngest child, pop the outside door open, Jimmy the inside latch, put Junior through the hatch to go and open the door from the inside.
Yeah, because it had to be fairly large to get the bottle.
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, they also had the milk wouldn't be homogenized, so the cream's at the top.
Yes.
And then if it's below zero, it would freeze, and you'd have this tube of cream coming up the top here.
And they did pasteurize because of glass bottles too,
Yeah,
which
they
is
did
important.
pasteurize, yeah.
I remember that because up until about 1910, pasteurization was very rare. And so we had a lot of children pass away early with unpasteurized milk, various things from rabies to TB in the milk. But with these, you sterilize them in boiling water, and then you put the milk in, and it was pasteurized. So it's much cleaner and safer, wasn't it?
Right, it was. But pasteurization, when it first came out, a lot of people were skeptical, and they felt that it diminished the nutrient value of the milk. So up until, it wasn't really widespread in Alberta till the 40s, and I don't believe it was a law till the 1990s.
Is that right?
Yeah, because there was a discussion about this on the news a number of years ago. And
You're right.
I was shocked how late the dates were. A lot of dairies were doing it ahead of time, but the actual government regulation dates came in later.
Wow.
So,
Can you imagine? And now, of course, we have the major mockery of Ontario that gets their milk from bags.
oh, yes. That's something they don't like
From
out
bottles.
here.
That's right.
Yeah, the bag milk,
Yeah.
which has been in place at least since the 70s.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
We all remembered getting a special little snipper to open the end of
That's right, yeah.
Nobody will know what that is. It's like those little round things that go on 45 records, right?
Yes,
To make
yeah.
them fit on the turntable.
Yeah.
What's that? It's a spider. Oh, the names. So, besides the fact that this is what trivia collectors and collectors really get excited about, what we're talking about is ways of life.
Oh, yeah, these are things that were commonplace to our parents and our grandparents. So these are things that they knew and took for granted, and we're not even aware of.
No, and they would have to introduce to their children how to operate this technology.
Yes.
Because they weren't changing that rapidly after all. We had to learn about milk bottles and all those kinds of things as well. So you're telling me then that a museum is a kind of social science laboratory?
I guess in a way, it's kind of showing you what life was like in the past, and just how different it was in terms of its material culture.
Yes.
And
Yes.
hopefully explaining some of the other parts of culture too that go along with it.
Yes.
For instance, you can imagine just the intake of news was much different when everything's coming in by the newspaper or the newspaper and the radio than the instantaneous feed we get from our cell phones now. So, I often wonder, when you look at the old photos and you see these houses out in the middle of a farm and they have no radio, they're relying on the newspaper, what people today, how isolated they would feel.
Yes.
I bet you some would have panic attacks.
You wonder, eh?
And yet back then it was perfectly fine to wait for the weekly paper to get your news. But, of course, a lot of people seem to know what was going on in the neighborhood anyway back then. So.
Well, of course, a party line meant people could be listening in sometimes too if they were stealthy enough. What you're telling me, though, underneath all of this is a time factor, a philosophy of time, or the movement of time. Physicists tell us that time and matter are connected, but they are in a life way as well. The pace of life that these things represent indicate a way in which time was measured differently in your day and with your children over lifestyle and life cycle. The whole idea of time moving at a slower pace or being less crowded, perhaps, with what's often been called the tyranny of the urgent.
Right.
Yeah.
And we think that, but they probably didn't notice it.
No, that's true too.
Right.
So there's a pull on a guest to a museum to develop the empathy, the imagination to kind of go back in time and imagine what life issues were. The thing about a museum is that you can look at it and say, well, that was the good old days.
You could. Yeah.
But you'd be wrong, wouldn't you?
Well, it's subjective, right? I think museums, we'd just out of necessity present maybe a rosy picture of the past. I mean, we don't maybe show the dirt and grime of the everyday when we're redoing the inside of a log cabin or something like that. But so it is a bit of a rosy picture. But I always say when I think, it'd be so nice to live back in those days, but would you want to go to the dentist back then?
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
You've got medical tools in the displays, right? And I'm looking at them imagining what it was like without freezing. And the dental drill was hand pumped, slow, I remember going from that style of drill to the more modern one when I was 10 in our little country dental practice. And what a miracle it was to us because it didn't hurt the same way as it did, with the foot pump. And we dreaded going to the dentist.
We did too.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean it. And then suddenly around my age, 10 or 11, it became routine. It was still a little scary, but the tension was different.
Yeah.
I mean, sitting in the dental chair for a 20-minute appointment seemed to be a lifetime to me.
Well, it helps with the freezing, right?
Oh, man,
when you're being subjected to excruciating pain, time moves slowly.
So, no kidding. And when you look at the size of the needles they were using, you realize getting a needle was excruciating sometimes too.
Well, it could be,
So I think that's where, for me, having a good guide or someone older who can kind of say, this is what this feels like, or this is what it means. Those things matter a lot. I think because of my specialties, I think of farming and military equipment. You have lots of implements there, but nobody maybe has ever chopped down a tree with one of those things or had to trim a square beam, or in terms of horsemanship. Much less the idea of you ever carried a rifle all day, one that weighs 8 pounds. Or 2.59 kilograms. But the bottom line is that thing gets heavy, and all the kit that goes with it. And I think people don't maybe understand the effort that living in the past, as well as the time-consuming processes.
Yeah, well, that's true. But what you say is correct. So when people are on a tour, you can give them all sorts of dates. They're not going to remember that. But they will remember the story about it being heavy.
Yeah.
And one of the jobs I had in Ontario, I was very fortunate because the family we were interpreting was still in living memory.
Oh, wow.
And it just happened the grandchildren grew up with the grandparents because the parents were missionaries. And one of the granddaughter's old boyfriends was still in town, right? So it was amazing the stories we could get. And that's what people love to hear. And they also, the lady of the house, Mrs. Jury, Janet Jury was her name. She had this dog, and the dog lived to be 18, which was an unheard of age in those days. He was so special, he got his own plot in the backyard, his own gravestone. And the stories about this dog were just legion in the town. And that's what the visitors remember. If they came to the house, they might not remember this date or that date, but they remember the dog.
Right.
And that's what keeps it in memory. And it makes it more personable, makes it more human, because, most people love dogs, right? So they really can relate to a dog story.
So do you have any examples of that in the museum now?
It's a little different because this was one house.
Yes.
We're interpreting many houses here, many different buildings. But, let's think of, let's say, we have like the Edson Trail caboose.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So just, you can start telling stories about the pioneers that were coming up. I mean, you can point out the various things, but when the pioneers first came up here, they took the Edson Trail and then they built their log cabin and oftentimes initially would have a sod roof.
Right.
So you can tell people that fact. They might remember it, they might not. But then you could tell them the story about Gerald Carveth, a pioneer from the Glen Leslie area, who was in his log cabin one morning making an omelet and decided he needed some mushrooms, and he didn't have any, so he just went outside, stood on a box, and clipped them off his sod roof, and then sliced them and threw them into the eggs frying in the pan. They'll remember that.
He survived, no kidding.
Yeah, because who can get mushrooms off their roof,
Well, not that you want to try, maybe anyway.
Well, he seemed unharmed by the effect.
So it sounds like you almost need to have a little scrapbook of anecdotes, case by case, or examples.
Yeah, anecdotes or just incidents in history, things that just they strike us as interesting today, and maybe were more matter of fact to them back then, right?
Yeah, I mean, you look at something like that. You even have an iron lung, I think.
We do at the Forbes house.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Those things are long gone in history now, although we still get the odd retired nurse who can remember them when they started.
Is that right?
They were still in operation then. And, what a horrible life these people must have had to be in those.
Because the iron lung actually did the breathing for you by creating a vacuum, expanded your chest, and then pressed the air out. But you couldn't move.
Yeah, your body's stuck in this tube, and your head's sticking out, and they'll prop you up during the day and put you down at night. Now, I understand from some nurses that some people were in there for short time, some for long time, some just periodically, but it couldn't have been
Must
very
have been
pleasant.
scary. Well, this is certainly the challenge with polio is it's been forgotten, like measles, which is why people resist getting the vaccinations now. And that's an aspect of our history that will be lost perhaps or missed unless we keep that alive.
Right.
So it's so often we're going back to childhood.
Yes.
How many people go to a museum and relive aspects of their life or of their grandparents' life or something too? So it's a social science laboratory in the sense that a person who's studying sociology can go in and say, what was it like for children to live in this format? Because the clothing collection you have is outstanding.
Yeah.
And you certainly have the styles of dress, some indigenous, but right through to the 1960s at least. And that's why it seems to be integrated so easily with archives, because you can have pictures in the archives of those items in use, on a human.
Oh, yes. Yeah, both complement each other very well. So, but speaking of kids, I guess the schoolhouse is a good example of that.
True.
So if you recall, the Hermit Lake School is a very typical school for the early teens. It was built in 1917.
Okay.
But when you walk in, the windows on the left side are quite large, and the windows on the right side are quite small. And that's not just a quirk of the architecture, it's actually purpose done so that the children would be forced to write with their right hand, because writing with your left was seen as not being good.
Not
Whereas
acceptable.
nowadays, nobody, I don't think, really cares that much. But back then, that was a big deal. You didn't want to be writing with your left hand.
Yes, I have a left-handed brother who was persecuted in our one-room school
Yeah.
for a while.
And it goes right back
Using
to the Bible, the right
wrong
hand of
hand.
God. And
Oh, that's
you
right.
know,
The sinister hand in Latin, right?
Yeah. So,
Right. So what you're saying then is if we go to a museum, there's going to be philosophy of life under some, there's social engineering going on. And I think that's something that a museum, with its labeling, and with its properly guided, you're actually showing people that not only were they just like us, they had an agenda, an ulterior motive sometimes for these things, especially for children who are to be shaped a certain way and have a certain attitude.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
But following the educators and the leaders of the times and what they thought was best may not have been right by our standards, but they thought it was best.
Yeah, the school is interesting because, of course, it has the photograph or the print, I guess, of the monarch.
Yes.
And it's not Elizabeth, it's pre-Elizabeth,
Yeah, it's
right?
actually your grandfather,
Well,
George
exactly,
V.
yes. And the way with cursive handwriting, they often had examples of the letters that you were supposed to draw in imitation so that your letters would look the same as those. I remember the years when I went from printing to writing. It was very painful for me to shift from that kind, because I had to move from sort of etching it out to drawing the letter.
Yes.
And that was
hard. Did you
hard.
have to use the dip pen or the fountain pen?
Both.
Okay.
Both. We had that. We dipped it first, and then we didn't have small slates, but we did have a big slate blackboard.
Okay.
And we practice on it with chalk. But I often joke about, here we are talking about using a Stone Age technology. We're writing on slate.
Right. Yeah.
With chalk, which is fossilized sea creatures.
Right.
I thought, this is like, really, it's like cavemen. Here we are, writing, and yet ironically, it was efficient because you could wipe it off.
Yes.
And then replace it. Now we have the whiteboard and everything, and
Right,
changes things. But there's a way in which that too indicated that we used to solve problems with muscle power that we wouldn't have the patience for today.
True.
Because who got the privilege of wiping off and then cleaning the erasers at the back door, banging?
That,
Well, that's it. I mean, and that time would be wasted in many people's minds, but it was part of everyday life, much like taking the water from the pump into the school to put in the water fountain.
Can I ask, what grade did you switch from pencil to pen?
Oh, good question. Grade 5, I think.
It's quite late.
Yeah, it
grade
was.
2.
Grade 2, wow.
And I remember it because I had a brother ahead of me, a year ahead of me, and he had they had to use fountain pens.
Right.
We were the first year they allowed ballpoints in the school.
Is that? Oh, wow.
They didn't trust ballpoints when they first came
that's
out.
right. Well, I had a fountain pen, and I had to fill it with a little thing to squeeze it in the back. And
That was real writing.
I made a lot of messes with that thing, over the years. Wow. So we're talking about educational technology that also reflects a philosophy. You're growing up when you go to ink.
Yes, that's right.
And you're growing up when you leave the slate or chalk and you go to pencil, and then you go to ink. And now, of course, there's all kinds of variations, but there are times when I wonder if pen technology is going to fade because paper is going to fade too.
Well, even the writing is fading. They don't teach cursive anymore, or they didn't for a long time. It may have come back now. I think maybe in some schools.
There's talk about the brain development that goes with it now.
Well, and just the fact to sign things, right?
No kidding.
That type of thing as well. But, just talking about technology, like we're always so quick to use the photocopier. And
yes.
Then, well, of course, we had the mimeograph.
Oh, yes.
And you'd turn it, and usually one of the students had to do that.
That's right. Crank the Gestetner machine.
They actually came out wet with acetone. And
of course,
yes. The word was you could get high on the acetone.
Well, when I was in teachers' college, when we went out to do practicums, they would put ventilation systems in the duplicating room so that the student teachers and the teachers wouldn't get high on the stuff, because we now realized it caused cancer. And how much asbestos is in the stuff in the museum,
Well, look at that film we showed, People of the Peace from 1958. That one lady, all she could talk about was this great asbestos mine because of what a wonderful product it was.
Exactly.
And they thought it was,
Yeah.
but they didn't know the consequences.
Well, that's the question, too, is as some things come into fashion and go out of fashion, it's another indication as you go through a museum that sometimes what seemed right actually later on becomes recognized as dangerous. or in some way unsafe, or just not efficient. The battle for gadgets has always fascinated me because they compete. They're commercial products, and often they're brand named. And do you want a McCormick thresher or do you want a Harris thresher?
Yeah,
so there's
Harris.
a capitalist project going on there of marketing, and even to the point of trade names on your, the thing that takes the pit out of your cherries, a little plunger, right? All of that was supposed to make it easier for mother or the farmer, right?
Right.
But did it?
Well, I guess it's easier to have a tractor than keep a whole stable of horses, that type of thing. So there is some easiness gain there, and I guess maybe there's initial cost for the tractor, but then it's cheaper to maintain over the long term. So there's a change there. It's a little more, I don't want to say reliable, but it's more, you can just start it up and go, whereas a horse maybe needs to get ready and that.
So we need to have a tractor museum somewhere.
Immediate. Well, we have lots on the piece here.
Well, that's true. Lots of
Lodge,
sitting on the side of the road sometimes, the threshing
sure.
machines. I sort of have a mental category for windmills and threshing machines when I drive around. So there we also see the idea of progress coming in, and museums become reservoirs of what's out of date.
Yes, that's very true.
And so we pride ourselves on progress, but we actually often go back and we discover that it's just the whole question of time and motion that's part of the Industrialization Project, and now it's post-industrial. I donated our first laptop to the museum. I don't know where it is now.
It's on the West Trailer. Yeah.
Yes, okay, it's in storage for now, but I mean that now is an artifact. A little DOS laptop that had a 126K memory kind of thing, and how that seems so primitive, even though it's electronic.
Well, and speaking in history, it really wasn't that long ago.
No.
But all that old technology, very little of it was saved, really. So it's become quite collectible. So we're actually quite fortunate. We've got quite a large collection of some of these early computers and early machines, so that that area is quite well represented.
So I don't want you to be now, because of the podcast, avalanched under loads of people bringing their stuff.
I don't need that much more, but we're always looking for Grande Prairie items.
Yes, okay.
That type of thing. But I think a lot of museums traditionally haven't collected anything that new. But it's rapidly seems that history is not taking as long as it used to.
No kidding.
So we're trying to keep up with the.
So you do have criteria. You have to give back the odd artifact or the odd donation.
No, right. We've been okay. We're getting an addition for extra space because we do need it. Yeah. We do have off-site storage. As the archives did. Now they're getting their new space, and then in a few years we'll have our new space. So we should all be okay. We might do some deaccessioning as well, which is taking items out of the collection. Typically that's done when you have multiple items and one is an inferior example. We would always try to offer it to another museum first.
Okay.
It might be offered back to a donor, but that can often be a tricky situation if the donor's passed away.
So I have this mental picture of someday your museum having a garage sale.
No, that'll never happen.
Okay, that's too dangerous, eh?
Yeah, there's very set rules about deaccessioning and disposing of items. We'll probably have to go to auction or in a different locale.
Well, I know this idea of offering it to other museums must be interesting because if you've got something, two of something, and they don't have any, there must be a network. Is it like a grapevine? Or
yes. So here in the piece, we have the Spirit of the Peace Museum Network. Around 35 museums are involved. The trouble is most of us are top heavy with the same item because, what was popular 100 years ago, pump organs and plows, right? Well, we all have lots of those.
Okay.
So, but if you get a truly rare item, or sometimes it's not a rare item, but the history is known and the history makes it desirable.
Yes.
So it belonged to a certain person, or they still had the bill of lading from the Edson Trail or something like that, that would make you want to have it.
Well, I was dumbfounded at seeing that little black portable organ, pump organ.
Oh, yes.
Which is military issue, right? And I've read about them, written about them, and here we've got one in Grande Prairie where I live and work and teach. And I'm thinking, I've never seen one. I've heard about them. It's kind of like, here it is. This is the thing. And I'm trying to imagine playing it. we're using it, and it's sitting next to a tank out at Wainwright. So how did it get up here? That's what I'd like to know. But that's when you can see right in front of you both the strengths and limitations of technology in the 1940s or 50s.
But isn't it interesting they could make an organ that small in the 1940s? I don't think most people would have thought that.
That's true.
And I used to work at a museum that specialized in organs and pianos, and we'd never seen one of those. They're pretty rare. So as soon as it came in, we knew we had something pretty special.
Good,
on
you
our
did.
hands.
That's right.
Yeah.
So don't let go of it, okay?
No, it's in a glass case actually right now.
I want those students who are writing about church music and religious music driving all the way from Quebec just to see it. I think that would be, because you do have artifacts that people can't find anywhere else.
Well, we've got some really rare items. I mean, just above the organ is that bicycle that a World War II paratrooper, being dropped down on Europe would have had strapped to his chest. And it's a bicycle that folds in two. It's on a hinge, kind of. Yeah. And when they landed, they could undo the bicycle from their chest, unfold it, tighten it up, and away they could go. It had hard rubber tires. And,
one of a kind,
and just got saved as military surplus, and we were very fortunate to get it. Most of them have been scrapped, right?
Yeah.
So they're quite rare to get. And of course, we've got a lot of rare items that came up from the Edson Trail. It could be pieces of furniture, that type of thing. But we know the history, the provenance, we call it. Yes. And that's what makes it very special. Right. I mean, if we knew that this came from the dairy that used to be near the museum on the ridge of the valley where Muskosipi Park is, that would make it much more valuable to us. But we don't. We just know it's a Canadian milk bottle. Happens to have been found here in Grande Prairie.
So I did a project with my students once on the 19th century. And I said, let's have a gadget fair. And they went off to all the used junk places into their own attic or the back of their barn. And they brought in some of the weirdest stuff I've ever seen. And the inventiveness, the gadgetry that people had. I was talking about popping pits out of your cherries with this little aluminum plunger, but other things like that. Ways to sharpen your safety razor blade, which we just dispose of them if we still even use them. And things like that. And I realized that coming to the Peace Country at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th is the roaring 20s, you might say, of gadgetry, hand-operated or coal-fired or kerosene-fired gadgets to make the life better. More work for Mother often, though. I look at some of these gadgets and I think they ended up in a dishpan at the end of the day. In the old days when Mom just cooked everything in a pot and put it on a plate, was that better for her? Then you had to have the gadgets because the expectation was that she would have this perfect table and everything perfectly delivered, made correctly. It's kind of interesting that progress actually could make more work for Mother in the kitchen.
Well, I guess there's a bit of propaganda there, too, with the keeping up with the Joneses kind of philosophy as well, because if someone gets it and it can do this wonderful thing, you're going to want it too. Okay, it's a little extra work, but we can handle that. Yes,
Mrs. Sarnicki down the road got a Hoover, so we need to have one now too.
Well, one of the things that struck me up here is there does seem to be a lot more of that gadgetry here than I noticed back in Ontario. And I think the reason is it was all new here, whereas in Ontario, they're still stuck with all the old stuff. And, being frugal people, they're not going to replace it till it's broken. But you get up here and you see, so one of the things are those the gas-powered motors for washing machines.
Yes.
So there's, I've seen these cabins where they have this little opening by the door, and that was for the belt to run from the gas-powered motor to the washing machine.
Okay.
So the wife who's doing the laundry would have to go outside, kickstart this motor, and then get her machine going. Well, all of a sudden now she has to know about this motor, maybe do some troubleshooting, because, her husband and kids are going to be out in the field or whatever, not accessible. If she wants to get her laundry done, she's going to have to know all this, right?
That's right.
A whole other avenue of knowledge she's going to have to know and maybe recognize when the belt's getting worn or things like that.
Or Junior gets his hand in the belt, which could happen too sometimes.
And then as an historian, you stumble across the remains of this log cabin, and you're going, what's that hole for in the wall, right? And your first instance, is that a cat door?
No, that's right, yes.
And you go, no, that was for the belt to run the
power takeoff
machine.
Belt. No kidding.
Yeah.
No kidding. It's interesting you say that, because I remember my parents using technology handed on from their parents, which old rusty saws and things like that. but they were still good, so they still used them. And it was out here that I got to see the latest brands and the new products, and there was no such thing as a Canadian Tire where we grew up, but there was certainly one here fairly early, as well as Hudson's Bay, Réveillon Frère, and the different tractors as well. They're different models. So as we look at this then, is this like, I can see education, I can see social science. Is there a recreational side?
Well, definitely. We're also an attraction, right? So in the summer, all the people coming up to the north, going their various travels, maybe they're going up the Alaska Highway, maybe they're going to Yellowknife, they're going to stop and see the museum because it's something they can do. And I think the city of Grande Prairie is very commendable, and they make their museums free. So they're not turning anyone away. So, and we often get very good reports from our visitors. It's the best museum we've seen so far. Really enjoyed it. I personally, when the lilacs are blooming and that, you're not going to find a prettier spot in Grande Prairie than the Heritage Village, right? Yeah. So it is a pretty spot. So there's a definite attraction appeal to it as well.
It's interesting to me that when you say that, this is a unique site in the Peace Country, that the Spirit of the Peace museums are all part of the same constellation up here of sites that make them all worthy of a visit and a reflection and comparison between the different museums. Because what you're saying, too, is that there's a sociological thing going on here, that there's a culture, a common culture. We say material culture, and everyone says, what does that mean? Well, it means that everybody's into gas-powered washing machines, or everyone's into homemade radios that didn't have transistors, or pump organs. That there's something going on here that's part of a general wave that is part of the farming frontier, a common technology that everyone was learning, everybody was shopping for, everyone lived with and could grow nostalgic about. But they were actually very important. They weren't kind of like nice technical toys. They were used every day.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when we see a pump organ, the analogy of a pump organ today is not another organ. It's the television set.
Yeah, true.
Because the pump organ was your entertainment center. Because everyone could play it to a certain degree. And if you wanted music, you had to make it yourself.
Yes.
Pump organs were relatively affordable, and they weren't as heavy as pianos, so they're easier to move.
No kidding.
So Saturday night, if you're going to have entertainment, you made it yourself, and you had your pump organ.
Right.
Right,
which means music collections matter a great deal to the kind of music people were singing. Were they singing Tin Pan Alley from the 20s or the earlier?
And you'll see special cabinets with all those little shelves, all for your sheet music.
Right.
People go, what would they use that for? Records? No, it was for sheet music.
Sheet music, right.
Records came later, yeah.
So it sounds like it would be good for folks to kind of, anywhere they live in the Peace Country, to look around and look in their cupboards, check their attics, and see if there are things they don't understand anymore.
Oh, definitely. And I think to realize we're up here, we're in a unique part of the country here. The Peace region was settled relatively late. It was the last best west.
Yes.
And it's an area that straddles Alberta and British Columbia. It's this beautiful area of rich agricultural land surrounded by muskeg, so it kind of delayed the development. So, the stuff that it came here by the railway, 1916, the railway came, so it came up here. So, things of a certain age, we can almost trace how they got here.
Yes.
And I don't think you can do that out east where there's many more options for things. And just the unique history of this area. I mean, at one point they were thinking it should be an area, a province unto
its own
itself,
province. Yes,
because it was so unique. And I know David Leonard once said, if it hadn't had that barrier of the muskeg around it, it would have been settled a lot sooner because the agriculture potential is so good.
It would have been a road network and road travel. No, indeed, it's true. That in itself tells us that there's a time capsule nature to the Peace Country that the museums code and collect for us. The great time capsule of development in this part of the country is actually embedded and protected in our museums of a very unique time in Canadian history.
Definitely, yeah. And while most of us started as pioneer museums, and so the pioneer is still a big part of what we do, we're all trying to expand to include the Indigenous history. because we realize that it's becoming more important and it's probably been neglected in the past.
Yes.
And it shouldn't have been. And here in the piece, we have a wonderful Indigenous history that goes back 10,000 years.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, or more.
if you remember your high school lessons about
yeah.
the Ice Age and the ice-free corridor, and the Laurentian and Cordilleran ice sheets with the ice-free. Grande Prairie's in the ice-free corridor. And so it was very early on that the Indigenous people came. And I just read an interesting paper from an archaeologist at U of A, and it kind of, the data is not conclusive, but it's kind of showing that the people came up from the south first and then came in from the north, which is interesting.
Yes, it's true. The points that I was talking to Daryl Barazuk from the Provincial Archives, the mammoth hunters are coming, their tools are coming from the south, not the north. And the ones coming from the north are people that are closer to Inuit and Dene structure in their construction of tools. This is from a later period. So it's kind of amusing. You have this image around Fox Creek of the two groups meeting. And then, of course, the question is, you got anything to eat?
Right.
What are you doing with this and what are you doing with that? The same way we sit and look at our tools sometimes to say, what's that for? Oh, what's that for? How do you make that? The tool thing goes back a long way.
It's a lot more complicated than what they showed us in school, where they came over Beringia and just came and filtered down into North and South America.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think they're realizing that with all the trade networks they're finding. I know the U of A they've used some of our jade items because they can actually source the jade to particular locations, and if they can figure out where it is in time from what site, and then they can say, well, they're getting their jade from here. Well, there's this jade deposit closer. Why weren't they going there? And then you look at the climate of the era and going, well, they couldn't. The ice was there, you see.
Excellent.
So, it's interesting to see how these trade networks develop.
So as curator, you're actually plugged into a provincial and to some degree international across the U.S. border network of learning.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm plugged in, but I do get snippets from time and time again, and I'm interested, so I kind of seek it out.
Well, that's what I mean. A curator is curious as well as systematic.
Yes.
And interested in linkages as well as protection.
And I'd like to point that out. So the term curator, just to borrow this idea from John McCavity, who used to be in charge of the Canadian Museum Association, he called curating one of the most overused terms in our society today. And he says, everyone's curating stuff. They're curating wine, they're curating cheese. And he goes, but that's not curate. Curating there's a presupposition that you've done some education first.
Okay.
And that's the part that people are missing. And so you're using it in the correct context.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to know that.
Yeah, you really have to have that history behind you. And it doesn't mean you have to have the formal degree, but you have to have the interest and you have to look into it.
Well, Jane Jacobs wrote a book called The Coming Dark Age back in the 2000s. And she said that the time came in the Middle Ages when people would come across a Roman artifact and not know what it was or what it was for, even Roman ruins, and not know what they were for. And she said that's when the true dark age comes, when there is no memory. And I've often thought that a museum here is a barrier against another dark age, and that if the day came that no one knew what was in our museums at all, it was from another time, it could have come from outer space, that these places would be really seriously all we have. And if we ever stop going, stopped enjoying, stopped remembering, even as children, that we actually lose. It's kind of like having a mental amnesia or Alzheimer's, or dementia that we lose without a museum as we become disconnected from the everyday but also the spectacular aspects of our past. And then we truly are at a dark age. I mean, if I were to ask you the rhetorical question, to you, what would it mean if museums were closed?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're doomed to repeat past mistakes if we don't know we've made them in the past, right? Museum can show you that, can show you the progression of things, and maybe that's why the things the way they are today. Gives you a bit of history to move forward in making better decisions. But there's also I think if you close the museums down today, you'll be losing a lot of community focus. Community museums are very good at creating, just people enjoying where they're living, learning the unique stories, that type of thing. So you're going to lose that. Once I started developing walking tours, the last museum I was at, and a lady came up to me and said, my son, his class took one of your walking tours, and he was so ecstatic because he thought he had to go to England for history. He didn't realize it was all around him. And it is, even here in Grande Prairie. I mean, people say, we're new, we don't have any history, but you do. And I was invited at one of the downtown festivals to do a historical commentary on a horse and wagon ride. And I'm able to do it. There is enough history there that we can do it.
Right.
And there's enough history on our main street. It may not look like it, but if you know what you're looking at, you'll see the history that's there.
The human history, right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, let's look at this last item that you brought in.
So the last item came to the museum, and right away, it's an Indigenous artifact, but you can tell it's very early because a lot of Indigenous artifacts these days are made for art galleries and things like that, but this is just done on a plain piece of plywood, so it does tell you that it's got some age to it. And I was very intrigued by this, and I turned it over, and on the bottom here, it says Eskimo Craft, Charles Camsell Hospital, Edmonton. And it's just been stamped on with an ink stamp, and the original price is here of $1.75.
Well, let's turn that to the camera too.
And then I thought, so my initial thought was, well, isn't that nice? There was probably a movement in this gift shop at this hospital to sell native crafts. And then, of course, I did research in the Charles Camsell Hospital, and I found out that it was an exclusively Indigenous hospital, primarily for tuberculosis patients from northern Alberta and Northwest Territories. And that's probably why it's got Eskimo here, but it should be Inuit.
The old term, yeah.
Yeah, the old term. And then it made, I started reading about it, and, these hospitals went with the residential schools in that they were exclusively Indigenous. And when you hear the news today with all the changes in our healthcare system and the challenges, people are fearful of a two-tiered health system, but it seems we already had one in Canada, one for the Indigenous and one for the settler population. And then I started thinking, well, was this just a nice native craft that was sold in a gift shop, or was this something a native person had to make to raise money to keep the hospital going?
Yeah, and it is handmade. You can see the tool marks under the paint.
Yeah,
right?
so
it's hand carved.
It brings up a lot of questions about reconciliation and what we were taught in history and what we weren't taught in history, and how we need to come to terms with that, and also look into these things so we can tell the truth, because of all things, when you're an historian, you want to be accurate.
Yeah, that's right.
And I just thought this item kind of highlights that. Now, I've only done initial research on it, so I can't really say exactly about any of these things we're talking about, but there's certainly questions that need to be asked and will certainly be used in the interpretation of this item. So this item should go to the Royal Alberta Museum. They have the Charles Camsell Hospital collection there. But my understanding is they have a lot of this stuff, so it's going to the Grande Prairie Museum.
Oh, good.
Because we did offer it, but they weren't interested.
Okay.
So,
well, that's interesting, because as you're holding that, what I'm thinking is you're not only touching history, you're touching a person.
Yes, exactly.
The handiwork of someone probably locked into a hospital bed on complete bed rest to recover. And how do they pass the time? If you don't want to do needlepoint and knitting, you carve. And yet what we're talking about here is it's kind of like when you take a student to a log cabin and you say, you're not just looking at a pile of logs here, you're looking at someone's sweat equity, skills with an axe, struggles with the weight, but also you're touching a person, you're touching a life. And this is a wonderful piece to reflect on, because it means that somebody here who was maybe even worried about living every day.
Yeah, did they survive?
Yeah, and they're carving a memory of a sacred animal.
Yeah. And the Camsell Hospital operated from 46 to 68, although it was a hospital till 93. So somebody has kept this for a long time. Why did they keep it?
Of course.
And we'll never know, of course. But so this was donated to a secondhand store. That's how the museum became aware of it, and then it was donated to the museum.
Yeah.
So they just didn't feel comfortable putting it out on the shelf when they knew the history of the hospital.
Yeah. Well, when you look at this, and I touch it from this side, but in my imagination, I can see someone carving it, touching it from that side, And in that process, all the, the hopes, the dreams, the fears, the hopes, and all the distance is lessened from my time to then.
And see, it's been repaired, so it broke at some point, but they
Yep.
thought enough of it.
Yes.
And maybe the maker, maybe the person who got it knew the maker. I don't know, who knows?
Yes, exactly.
So it can tell you a lot. There's just a lot of wonder around it. And so we've expanded our Indigenous section. So it'll be going in there in the main museum gallery. But, as you've probably heard, we've got some engagement sessions coming up at the end of March for a new gallery at the museum.
Right.
And part of that project will be a new Indigenous gallery that will give more space and more prominence to the Indigenous history of this area.
Well, thank you, Charles. As we draw this to a close, because, you and I could talk all day.
Yeah,
but
we probably could.
Yeah, as we draw this to a close, what you're saying, though, is that this process of developing, curating, expanding, communicating through a museum is a place for a bit of wonder, a bit of awe, a bit of reverence, because behind all the artifacts are people.
Yes,
And their lives and their hopes, their stories.
Stories,
I can think of the stories I could tell about electrical wiring as a kid, touching bare wires with old lamps and things like that. But there's a bit of a reverence we can have for these items because they are, in fact, we're touching people, which is what history has to do, to have a soul. And you are doing a great job, I think, of gathering the soul of the piece out of its people and these things that populated their lives. So thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
This is important. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks.
So thank you very much. Our next podcast we're working on is coming up in a couple of weeks, we hope, depending on the schedule. And once again, thank you to Charles Taws for coming all the way originally from Ontario, like so many other
8
people.
years ago.
But like so many of us, economic refugees to the east, but has found a way to really contribute to our lives here as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Duff. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Okay, well, we'll see you again.
Thank you for tuning in to the PCHS podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you are notified when we release new episodes. To learn more about the Peace Country Historical Society, visit our website, pc-hs.ca.